All right. Well, we can get started. Can everyone hear me? Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining me for One Night Stand. My name is Kate Kunau. I am the curator of collections and exhibitions at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And tonight we are going to talk about one of my favorite pieces in our collection. I've been at the museum for around 8 years now, and I've always loved this one. So tonight we're going to focus on our bust of Caracalla, which is dated from 212 to 217 AD. And I'm going to put him in some good historical context. And of course, all Roman emperors have very juicy stories, but his more so than usual. So to begin, if you're a Roman emperor and you happen to take your name from a clothing choice, the odds are that the judgment of history will not be kind to you. So we do have some context for this. The Emperor Gaius, better known today as Caligula, for the little boots or caligae he wore in imitation of the soldiers, has become a byword for the depravity and cruelness and unusual sexual practices that happened during his reign. Just less than 2 centuries later, Rome was ruled by another emperor who was named for his fashion choices. From 211 to 217 AD, the empire was ruled by Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, previously named Lucius Septimius Bassianus. However, history better knows this emperor as Caracalla, and that name is derived from the caracalis, which is a heavy hooded cloak associated with the soldiers from the Gallic, French, and Germanic frontiers. None of these are ours, but I included, these are 3 other busts of Caracalla that show that cloak a little bit better, because our bust is pretty much starts at the neck. So these you can see the Caracalla in. So like Caligula before him, Caracalla became notorious in history, particularly for the sculptural record of himself he left behind. As you can see, his distinctive glaring portrait that we have in the CRMA collection stands out in galleries of imperial busts, especially thrown into sharp relief by the calmer, more serene visages of his predecessors. So this is an example of an earlier emperor. This is the Augustus Prima Porta from the turn of the millennium. And Augustus is being portrayed as a god among men, even though he branded himself first among equals. So with Caracalla, we turn both to a much higher level of realism, which is really fascinating. And again, this is a different portrayal of Caracalla, but you can see the deeply drilled hair, the attention to the detail on the face. Like, this is not an idealized godlike man. This is an actual portrait of an individual who really lived. So Caracalla was not born to be an emperor. He was born in 188 AD in the city of Lugdunum in southern Gaul, which is modern-day Lyon, France. His father, Septimius Severus, was from the port city of Leptis Magna in modern-day Libya, while his mother, Julia Domna, was from a family of aristocratic priests of the god El Gaba, which was an Arab-Roman sun god, in what today is the Syrian city of Emesa, or modern Homs. Later, the senatorial historian Cassius Dio, who was no great fan of Caracalla's, would blame this ancestry for the Roman emperor's character flaws, claiming that he had, quote, the fickleness, cowardice, and recklessness of Gaul, the harshness and cruelty of Africa, and the craftiness of Syria. And we are looking at a painting of Septimius Severus and Julia Domna here at the top, and the amphitheater in Lyon, France, his birthplace, on the bottom. So to set the stage with what was going on in the Roman Empire, by 193 AD, the Roman Empire is in total disarray. We have just seen the assassination of the Emperor Commodus, who was strangled by a wrestler in his bath on December 31st, the year 192. And this had thrown the issue of imperial succession into question, and rival claimants appeared across the empire, including Caracalla's father, Severus, who was backed by the legions from parts of Austria, Hungary, and former Yugoslavia. Severus's ultimate victory in the series of civil wars that followed and lasted until around 197 secured his position as the Roman emperor. Part of Septimius Severus's rule involved the explicit naming of Caracalla as his heir by awarding him the title of Caesar in 195, marking him as his junior partner in power. And the painting that we're seeing on the right here is obviously a much later, a late 18th century recreation of Septimius Severus, naming Caracalla as Caesar. This was done to the dismay and derision of the Senate. Severus also posthumously had himself adopted into the dynasty of the previous emperor Marcus Aurelius, therefore making himself the brother of the recently murdered Commodus. He confirmed this by renaming his son Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, and so this is how his imperial destiny was confirmed. So Caracalla was not the only child of Severus and Julia Domna. His younger brother, Geta, who was named after his father's brother, was born just a year after him in 189 AD. Although Caracalla remained the senior of the two for most of their adolescence, Severus increasingly sought to cultivate them both as his heirs and even named Geta as Augustus in 209, meaning that all three Severan men now effectively enjoyed the same status. By the time of Severus's death in York in 211 AD, Caracalla and Geta would succeed their father as co-emperors. So obviously this is a plan that's going to work out great. And this is my nod to The Office, of course, because having multiple rulers who are supposed to have supreme power is just an idea that clearly has no flaws. So unsurprisingly, sibling rivalry had been simmering beneath the surface of the life at the Severan court for years. At first, when they were children, this was largely innocent competition, typical of brothers. Caracalla reportedly badly injured his leg in a chariot race against Geta. The death of their father, however, accelerated the breakdown in their relationship, and factions and supporters and sycophants grew around each of the emperors. And this untenable situation resulted in Caracalla contriving the murder of Geta. The accounts of the murder itself vary slightly, but it appears that on December 26, 211, there was a disingenuous reconciliation between the brothers. Praetorian guards stormed into the room and, on the orders of Caracalla, slew his younger brother, who died in his mother Julia Domna's arms. Again, we see a late 18th century, early 19th century recreation of that scene in the upper left-hand corner. There followed a period of devastating bloodshed as the supporters of Geta everywhere were purged. Across the empire, images of the young man were torn down and vandalized. We see an example of that in the lower right. This is an act of damnatio memoriae, or what we call condemnation of memory. The CRMA has a bust in our collection that might possibly be attributed as Geta, which would make it quite unusual because not very many survive. Perhaps most cruelly of all, it is even said that Caracalla forbade his mother from mourning for the death of her son. Not surprisingly, war was a recurrent theme throughout the reign of Caracalla, both in his youth as Caesar and co-emperor with his father and as sole ruler. He, by all accounts, really delighted in the company of soldiers upon whom he lavished tremendous sums of money. Like his father, Septimius Severus, he saw his legitimacy as Roman emperor deriving directly from his support amongst the soldiers. His first experience of war came in the last days of the 2nd century as he accompanied his father on the Parthian campaign, which is largely modern-day Iran. An event commemorated on the colossal arch of Septimius Severus that is now found in the Roman Forum, an overview of the arch in the center, and then a detail depicting the Parthian campaign on the right. In the last years of his father's life, Caracalla also accompanied Severus on his campaigns in Britain. If you remember, his father died in York. Another attempted Parthian campaign was to be the final endeavor of his reign. So Caracalla doesn't reign all that long, really, just from 211 to 217. Parthia was reeling from its own turbulences of succession, and Caracalla appears to have seen this as an opportunity to extend Roman influence in the East. In order to pursue the war, Caracalla was compelled to invent a motive, and there are various accounts of perhaps an abortive marriage proposal made to the daughter of the Parthian king. According to the historian Herodian, who's not always reliable, in the midst of a celebration of this union, Caracalla ordered his soldiers to massacre the Parthian guests, which sounds very Game of Thrones. And Herodian is often a little dramatic in his historical retellings. But the money that was spent by Caracalla to ensure the loyalty of his soldiers was to prove ultimately futile. In the spring of 217, Caracalla was traveling to the lunar temple at Karhe in southern Turkey, as we see here on the map, when he stopped at the side of the road to relieve himself. As he turned away from his guards, he was approached by a soldier named Julius Martalius, who motioned that he wished to say something to the emperor. And taking the otherwise engaged emperor by surprise, Martialis drove a dagger into the emperor's back, killing Caracalla. Midstream, half-dressed and unaware, it was an ignoble end for an emperor who had spent the previous years of his reign proclaiming his heroism and military capacities. Martialis could and did not escape. He was cut down by the emperor's guards as he attempted to flee. But the fact remained, however, that there was no imperial succession. That needed to be urgently addressed, as Caracalla had no heir. The Roman army at this point is deep into Parthian territory, surrounded by the forces of the king Artabanus, who sought revenge for Caracalla's earlier treachery. And so the power passed reluctantly to Macrinus, who was Caracalla's praetorian prefect, just to have someone be in charge. So following his undignified death on the dusty, sun-baked road to Karhe, Caracalla's remains were returned to Rome and deposited in the Antonine Mausoleum, today called Hadrian's Mausoleum, because that's where all of the imperial remains since the reign of Hadrian have been deposited. The Roman Senate, in particular, was really delighted to see the end of his reign, but his popularity with the soldiers around the empire ensured that no official memory sanctions could be passed against him by Macrinus, as Caracalla had done to his brother. So there was no damnatio memora, even though he didn't have a great reputation amongst people. Caracalla kind of looms in and out of the Roman imperial consciousness like a bad-tempered ghost. Even in the 4th century, satirical writing by the Emperor Julian says he is banished from the company of the gods to atone for his crimes. Although Caracalla had left Rome in 213 and never returned, it could be argued that few Roman emperors actually left such a lasting impression on the material fabric of the city as Caracalla did. This is, of course, the Thermae of Caracalla, a monumental bath complex that he built in the southeast portion of Rome near the start of the Via Appia. The baths of Caracalla were begun around 211, 212, but not completed until 216. And at the time, they were the largest bathing structure in the Roman Empire and were unsurpassed until the baths of Diocletian were built in the early 4th century. They drew on the architectural model offered by the baths of Trajan on the Appian Hill, but represent the jewel in the crown of the Severan imperial capital. So here we see a reconstruction of what they would have looked like in their heyday on the upper left, and the very still imposing, still very fantastic ruins that exist today in the lower right. So they remain one of the most impressive monuments of antiquity that can be explored by modern tourists. And their architectural significance can still be seen around the world. This is actually especially notable in the United States, where the vast domed pieces of the Thermae inspired the architects who designed the original Penn Station in New York, and of course, Chicago's Union Station. Other than building the baths, another significant thing that Caracalla is known for is granting all free people in the Roman Empire citizenship in 212 AD. This is significant because it meant that all free peoples in the empire were now full Roman citizens, a right that was previously only granted to provincial citizens as a reward, or occasionally to freed slaves. It's sometimes said that Caracalla's motivation for this act was to collect more taxes, but some argue that this is a really drastic action if you're just trying to raise taxes. So we might never know for sure what Caracalla's motivation for this was. However, it did substantially change the way the Roman Empire functioned as new methods popped up to segregate different groups of people. So the figure of Caracalla returns to prominence in art history in all places in 18th century France on the eve of revolution. Translations of the histories of Cassius Dio, Herodian, And the Historia Augusta rejuvenated Caracalla as an emblem for a changing world. And to the artists of France in the late 18th century, he was an emblem of immorality in leadership, which not surprisingly would really attract artists during this time. First, he was imagined as an enemy of the family unit, as depicted by Greuze. Here we see the painting I used before, Jean-Baptiste Greuze's Septimius Severus and Caracalla from 1769. And we see two versions of Jacques-Louis David, who did a whole series on Caracalla on the right, both his murder of his brother and then being avenged by his brother's ghost. His iconic grimacing portrait, as we've seen that there are dozens of versions of, really served as a readily recognizable vision of tyranny, as artists like David painted in the atmosphere of the revolution and railed against autocracy. David planned paintings of 4 episodes from Caracalla's life and completed drawings of 2, but he never got around to the finished work. So this is where Caracalla kind of resurfaced in history. But as I said earlier, he hovers throughout Roman history, although he reigned for a very short time. He has a really profound impact on the way people think. So going back to CRMA's version of this very interesting man, he grabs me in the Roman gallery just because of his fierce expressions. So many Roman busts are very flat, and they're have a 1,000-yard stare and there's no expression. And I love our Caracalla for his furrowed brow, and he's kind of sneering and he's absolutely looking at something specific. So I think he has a real personality, and so it's really fun to dig into his past and realize like how real and true to life this particular bust of him was. I wish we had a little bit more neck and could maybe see the Caracallus itself. But you don't get to choose with ancient sculpture, so we're very glad to have the version that we have. All right. Are there any questions about anything that I didn't cover or that you're curious about?
Is there a way to authenticate the bust that we have in the collection to see if that is the brother?
Geta is really hard to authenticate because there are so many versions destroyed. So there really isn't like a firm extant version that you can use to authenticate the others, unlike other Roman emperors where, there's enough Marcus Aureliuses, enough Hadrians that people like know what those look like. But Geta, because so many images were destroyed, there isn't a standard version that you can use to compare the others to, which makes it particularly difficult.
Okay, you may not know the answer to this, but is that the most recent Roman bust in the collection of Roman busts that we have? Is that the latest?
I believe it is. I think that is the most recent one that we have. Because I can't immediately think of anything that we have that's later than 217.
I know that the way it's positioned in the gallery, it does imply that it's the most piece, and certainly stylistically, it feels the most recent because it's at that point in the Roman Empire when sculpture was more true to life, idealized, more true to life, more a reflection of the turbulent times in which Caracalla lived, and so many of our other busts are idealized despite the conflicts or difficulties of the times. The figures look serene, as I think you said, and so this certainly feels the most current, but I wasn't sure of that, so I thought I would ask.
Yeah, and I know the names of the ones we have, and we certainly don't have a Constantine, we don't have no Domitian or anything like that. So I can't recall the name of anyone who comes after him in the Roman line. So I think hedging my bets slightly, but yes, I think he might be the most chronologically recent one that we have. And you're right, he does look substantially different from the others. Other questions?
Is that bust part of the Riley collection?
It is. Yeah, it came in the late 90s with the Riley pieces. They were very generous with us, and the whole collection is a wonderful get, but Caracalla is distinctly my favorite. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I'd like to say thank you for joining me this evening. Loved having you. And this will be posted on YouTube in a few days if you want to reference it for anything else. And certainly, please come into the museum and see Caracalla for yourself sometime. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.